Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Gill, a research analyst with the Houston Education Research Consortium, or HERC. This presentation is another in our series of presentations on student mobility and focuses specifically on looking at the predictors of school year mobility for 4th through 8th graders in the Houston region. So what did we find? First, Black students have the highest mobility in our data, and at first glance appear to be much more likely to change schools during the school year than any other race ethnic group. However, much of this difference was explained by other factors. In particular, one of the most important predictors of student mobility was students' prior year STAAR test performance. Specifically, students who had scored lower on the prior year STAAR tests were much more likely to move than students who scored higher. Additionally, once prior test score was considered, the difference in mobility between Black and white students was cut in half. Finally, the single best predictor of student mobility was whether or not a student was mobile in the prior school year. But while this was the strongest predictor on its own, it did not account for any of the differences between Black students, white students, and Hispanic students' mobility. Now that we've told you about what we found, let's talk real quick about how we found it. We analyzed data from a sample of 4th through 8th graders who started the 2016-17 school year at a public school district in the Houston area. We included only 4th through 8th graders so that we could include students' prior STAAR performance in our models, and these are the grade levels of students most likely to have taken STAAR the year before. In order to maximize our sample size, we coded prior year STAAR scores into deciles and included an additional missing category if a student didn't have a score from the prior year. This allowed us to adjust for any potential nonlinear associations and include students who were missing their prior year's score. Looking at 4th through 8th graders who started the 2016-17 school year in a Houston area public school district, about 8% of our sample changed schools at least once during the school year. To see what predicted whether or not a student changed schools, we used a logistic regression model with changing schools as our outcome, and included in this model measures of student characteristics, whether the student was mobile in the prior year STAAR performance, and an indicator of which school district the student started the year in. Now let's turn our attention to our key findings in a bit more detail. Again, one of our main findings was the higher mobility of Black students. And as the figure on the left shows, Black students were about twice as likely to move as Hispanic students and white students, and nearly 3 times more likely than Asian students to change schools. Importantly, this difference is without including anything else in the model. So the more than 13% of Black students who were mobile in 16-17, compared to the less than 7% of Hispanic and white students, is what we refer to as our baseline or raw difference. But we know there are many factors that might predict whether or not a student will change schools. So we ran the model again, this time including some of those other factors, the prior characteristics, the student characteristics discussed on the prior slide, along with last year's STAAR performance and prior year's mobility. When these factors are included in the model, the results, which appear in the graph on the right, tell a bit of a different story. While we can see that the bar for Black students is still the tallest, meaning that as a group they still have the highest predicted mobility, the difference is not nearly as large as the difference shown on the left. Black students are now only about 1.4 times more likely to move than Hispanic students, and the difference in the mobility of Black students and white students is negligible. In fact, while in the initial model on the left, the probability of Hispanic students and white students changing schools is pretty similar, the gap between these groups widens such that white students were 1.25 times more likely to change schools than Hispanic students after these other factors are considered. That is to say, white students actually have a predicted probability of mobility that is 25% higher than that of Hispanic students in the graph on the right. Obviously, there's a lot going on in these models, and the story from the baseline model on the left is noticeably different from the story in the model, including the other factors on the right, which led us to ask, what's going on here? Which factor or factors was most responsible for explaining how we go from that story on the left to the story on the right? So we investigated the change in these findings to see what might be the main contributing factor, and what we found was students' performance on the previous year's STAAR scores was particularly relevant. As this graph shows, performance on STAAR in the previous year was predictive of student mobility on its own. Going left to right across the graph, as a student's score goes up, that's the x-axis, their likelihood of being mobile goes down. That's the shorter and shorter bars. That tall bar to the far right, that's the bar showing the probability of being mobile for students who are missing their prior year STAAR scores. Students with the lowest STAAR scores, those on the far left, are 4 to 5 times more likely to change schools during the year than students with the highest scores on the right. Students with missing scores on the far right are about as likely to be mobile as students with lower scores. Importantly, for understanding which factors explain away the difference in mobility between Black, white, and Hispanic students, when prior STAAR performance is included in our models, the gaps between race and ethnic groups are almost cut in half. And that's just with including prior performance. No other factor single-handedly accounts for as large a portion of the race-ethnic differences in mobility. So prior performance appears to be driving some students and their families to change schools. While we can see here that there's a relationship between STAAR performance and student mobility, it's not quite clear how the relationship works. Are lower performing students more likely to move because families are looking for better educational outcomes? Or are the same conditions driving both the lower performance and the decision to move? Is it some combination of these stories? This slide might begin to shed light on some of those questions. For this slide, we're once again looking at the association between prior STAAR performance and mobility, but we're doing it separately for each race ethnic group. That's what is represented by the different lines. The gray line is for Black students, the red line for Hispanic students, and the green line is for white students. A couple of things to note. First, the lines for the Black students and Hispanic students go in a downward direction and are generally parallel to each other. That is to say, as Black students and Hispanic students' scores go up, their probability of being mobile goes down, and they go down in a relatively similar fashion. In contrast, for white students, while their line is also downward, as white students' scores increase, their likelihood of moving decreases. The slope of the line is much steeper than any other group. In fact, white students go from having the highest mobility of the lowest performers to having the lowest mobility of the highest performers. White students scoring in the bottom 10% of scores on the prior year's STAAR were nearly 8 times as likely to move as white students scoring in the top 10%. The sharp decline in the likelihood of being mobile for white students compared to Black students or Hispanic students suggests that there may be different processes at play influencing mobility in these groups. For example, it could be that lower performing white students belong to families with more resources, who are more able to move their students to other schools in hopes of improving education outcomes. So, is there an element of families of white students with lower scores being more likely to proactively move for different education opportunities? Unfortunately, as clear as the relationship between mobility and lower student performance seems, we can't really tell from the data available to us how the mechanisms work. Are lower performing students more likely to move, especially white students, because their families are seeking proactively different educational opportunities? Or are factors our models aren't capturing driving both mobility and lower student performance? We know the answer here doesn't seem to be economic disadvantaged because our results tell us economically disadvantaged students aren't really any more likely to move than their similar non-economically disadvantaged peers. But there could still be other factors at play that are hard to gauge with administrative data. Finally, the single best predictor of student mobility in the 2016-17 school year was whether or not a student moved in 2015-16. Previously mobile students were more than 3 times as likely to move again as previously non-mobile peers. In other words, if you want to predict which students will move during this current school year, the best piece of information you can have is if they moved in the prior year. So why do we save the strongest predictor for last? Well, despite being the strongest predictor of whether or not a student changed schools in 16-17, prior year mobility did not account for any of the differences between Black students, white students, and Hispanic students' mobility. The fact that prior year mobility matters for current year mobility most likely means that whatever conditions influenced the original move were not resolved by that move and are probably driving the move in the current year. But determining this for sure would require additional data beyond what was available for this study. And even if this were the case, it was seemingly unrelated to families' decisions to move due to prior student performance. Further evidence of the likely existence of many different types of and reasons for student mobility. Yet at the end of the day, they all still mean a student has changed schools in the middle of the school year. This was a lot of information to process. So let's talk some big picture takeaways. First big takeaway, Black 4th through 8th graders are the most likely student group to move overall, but the gaps between them and white students and Hispanic students narrow noticeably when other factors are accounted for, especially STAAR performance in the prior year. Second, we see some evidence that there may be different processes at play among white students with lower STAAR scores compared to similarly performing Black or Hispanic peers, which prompts some additional questions beyond the scope of this study, but are worth potential future investigation. Finally, mobility in the previous school year is the strongest predictor of current school year mobility, potentially reflecting that whatever conditions influence that first move remain in place even after the move. But again, prior mobility did not explain any of the race ethnic group differences in mobility. To wrap things up, let's talk next steps. HERC will be releasing district-specific versions of these findings in the coming weeks. Additionally, as these series of studies on student mobility wrap up, project summary documents will be made available as well. Finally, and as always, we welcome your thoughts, feedback, and additional guidance on studying student mobility. Any questions, feedback, or other thoughts, please reach out to me, Patrick Gill, or Dan Potter at the emails listed here. And to make sure you don't miss any of the research releases from HERC, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and sign up to receive our monthly newsletter. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.